The friends of the person you love told them to move on. But what they said through tears left everyone speechless and completely surprised. Something happened last night that nobody expected. It was the kind of conversation that begins quietly, almost casually, and then suddenly becomes so emotional that everyone in the room realizes they are no longer talking about an ordinary situation. The people around the person you love had gathered with one intention: they wanted them to let go. They wanted them to stop thinking about you. They wanted them to accept that perhaps it was time to move forward, close the chapter, and choose a different direction. They thought they knew what your person needed. They thought they understood the situation. They thought they were helping. But then your person looked at them through tears and said something that changed the entire atmosphere. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. The room became completely still. The conversation that had started with advice suddenly became something much deeper. Something honest. Something your person had apparently been carrying inside for much longer than anyone realized. And the surprising part was not simply that they still cared about you. The surprising part was why. Because when everyone told them to move on, your person finally stopped trying to explain themselves and spoke from the deepest place in their heart. They said, in essence, "How am I supposed to move on from someone who changed the way I understand love?" Those words landed differently. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. Nobody offered another piece of advice. Because suddenly, the people who had been telling your person to forget you realized they had been looking at the situation from the outside. They had been judging the distance, the silence, the misunderstandings, and the time that had passed. But they had not seen what was happening inside your person. They had not seen the memories. They had not heard the conversations your person had replayed privately. They had not witnessed the moments when your person almost reached out and then stopped. They had not felt the weight of everything left unsaid, and most importantly, they had not understood that sometimes a person can appear to be moving forward while their heart is still standing somewhere in the past, waiting for an answer. This message is not telling you that you must wait for anyone. It is not asking you to stop living your life. It is not asking you to build your future around a promise you have never received. Instead, take this as a story about honesty, emotional courage, and the strange way people sometimes discover what matters only after everyone around them tells them to let it go. Because something changed last night, your person was forced to confront a question they had been avoiding. If I truly wanted to move on, why does the thought of losing this person forever still hurt so much? That question stayed in the room, and nobody had an easy answer. The conversation had apparently begun when one of their friends noticed that your person seemed distracted again. Maybe they had been staring at their phone. Maybe they had become quiet after someone mentioned a familiar place, a familiar song, a familiar name, or something that reminded them of you. Their friends noticed. They had noticed before. For a while, they had tried to ignore it. But last night, someone finally said what everyone had been thinking: you need to move on. It was probably meant as kindness. Sometimes people say difficult things because they believe they are protecting someone from disappointment. They see a person hurting, and they think the solution is simple: forget them, stop checking, stop remembering, stop hoping, meet someone new, start over. But the human heart does not always work according to simple instructions. You cannot command yourself to forget something meaningful just because someone else thinks you should. You cannot erase an emotional connection by pretending it never mattered, and you cannot force closure simply because the calendar has changed. Your person listened. They did not argue immediately. They sat there, quiet, almost as though they were considering whether their friends were right. Then someone repeated the advice, "You deserve someone who chooses you without hesitation." That sentence struck a nerve. Your person lowered their eyes. For a few seconds, they said nothing, and then the tears came, not dramatic tears, not the kind designed to get attention, the quiet kind that appear when someone has been holding too much inside for too long. Their friends became uncomfortable, because they had expected resistance. They had expected an argument. They had expected your person to defend you or perhaps deny their feelings. They had not expected emotion. And when your person finally spoke, their voice was reportedly different, soft, tired, honest. They said, "You think I don't know that?" Everyone became silent. Your person continued, "You think I haven't tried?" That was the moment everything changed, because suddenly the conversation was no longer about whether your person should move on. It became about what they had already tried to do. They had tried to distract themselves. They had tried to become busy. They had tried to convince themselves that time would erase everything. They had tried to tell themselves that what happened between you was only temporary. They had tried to minimize the memories. They had tried to act unaffected. They had even tried to believe that perhaps you had forgotten them, but every time they thought they were finally getting somewhere, something brought the feelings back, a familiar place, a certain time of day, a random conversation, a photograph, a phrase, a memory. Sometimes it was something incredibly small, and yet that tiny thing would suddenly remind them of you. That is what their friends did not understand. They were not simply holding on to a person. They were holding on to an experience. They were holding on to the version of themselves they discovered around you. They were holding on to moments when they felt understood. They were holding on to things they never said. They were holding on to possibilities that never had the chance to become reality. And perhaps most painfully, they were holding on to the question of what might have happened if fear, timing, distance, pride, or circumstances had been different. Your person looked at their friends and said something that left everyone speechless. "I don't miss them because I'm lonely." They paused. "I miss them because they mattered." That sentence changed the entire conversation, because there is a difference between missing someone because you are afraid to be alone and missing someone because their presence genuinely affected your life. Your person was not saying that you were perfect. They were not pretending that nothing difficult had happened. They were not denying mistakes. They were not claiming that everything would magically work out. They were simply admitting something they had been afraid to say aloud. You mattered, and maybe you still matter. That realization can be uncomfortable, especially when everyone around you has already decided what the answer should be. Sometimes people become so determined to protect us from disappointment that they accidentally pressure us to deny our own emotions, but your person could not deny theirs anymore. They told their friends that they had been trying to understand why they still felt connected to you. They wondered whether it was nostalgia, whether it was regret, whether it was unfinished business, whether it was love, whether it was simply the memory of a chapter that had ended before they were ready. They admitted they did not have all the answers. But they knew one thing: they were not ready to pretend you never mattered, and that honesty made everyone uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, because it was real. One friend reportedly asked, "Then what are you going to do?" Your person did not answer immediately. That question was bigger than it sounded, because saying you still care is easy when you are alone. Doing something meaningful with that truth is much harder. Your person knew that. They knew feelings alone do not create a healthy relationship. They knew that if there were ever going to be another chapter, it would require honesty, respect, communication, and changed behavior. They knew that simply missing someone was not enough. They knew that love, if it is ever to become something lasting, must eventually become action, and perhaps that is what made their words so powerful. They were not saying, "I want to live in the past." They were saying, "I cannot lie about what the past meant to me." That distinction matters, because sometimes the deepest form of emotional maturity is not chasing what has left, it is acknowledging what mattered without allowing it to control your future. Your person seemed to understand that. They said they did not want to force anything. They did not want to appear suddenly and demand an answer. They did not want to interrupt your life. They did not want to make promises they could not keep. But they also could not continue pretending that their heart had completely moved on when it had not. The room became quiet again. One of their friends finally softened. Perhaps they had expected your person to be stubborn. Instead, they saw someone vulnerable, someone confused, someone trying to make sense of a feeling that had survived longer than expected. And then your person said something else. "I don't know what happens next." That sentence may have been the most important one of all, because it showed that they were not claiming certainty. They were admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty is often where genuine change begins. Maybe they will reach out. Maybe they will eventually have a conversation with you. Maybe circumstances will create an unexpected opportunity. Maybe the two of you will discover that your lives are better apart. Maybe you will discover that what you thought was unfinished actually needed to end. No one knows. And that is okay. The meaning of this message is not that some invisible force guarantees a particular outcome. The meaning is that truth has a way of surfacing when people become tired of hiding from themselves. Last night, your person finally stopped hiding. They stopped pretending. They stopped saying, "I'm fine." They stopped allowing everyone else to speak for them, and they admitted what they felt. That is why their friends were stunned, not because your person made some grand romantic declaration, but because they finally told the truth. They said that there were things they wished they had done differently. They wished they had communicated better. They wished they had been braver. They wished they had not allowed fear to make decisions for them. They wished they had said certain things when the moment was still there. And as they spoke, the regrets began to surface, not as dramatic confessions, but as small memories. A conversation they ended too quickly, a message they never sent, an apology they delayed, a moment when they wanted to stay but walked away, a time when they wanted to say, "I care about you," but replaced it with something safer. Those small moments can become enormous in memory. Because years later, a person may not remember every ordinary day, but they remember the moment they almost told the truth. Your person remembered those moments, and perhaps they finally realized that avoiding vulnerability had protected them from immediate discomfort but created a much deeper regret. Their friends listened. Someone asked them whether they believed you still cared. Your person became quiet. They said they did not know, and that answer was important, because they were not assuming. They were not pretending to know your feelings. They understood that you had your own heart, your own experiences, your own boundaries, and your own life. They said that if you had moved on, they would have to respect that. If you no longer wanted anything to do with them, they would have to accept it. If you had found peace without them, they would not want to disturb it. But they also admitted that part of them still hoped there might someday be an honest conversation, not a dramatic reunion, not a perfect movie moment, just a conversation, a chance to say what was never said, a chance to listen, a chance to understand. And maybe that is what your person truly wants. More than anything, not certainty, not fantasy, clarity. They want to know what was real. They want to understand what happened. They want to know whether the connection they felt was shared or whether they had been carrying it alone. They want to know whether there is anything worth rebuilding, and if there is not, perhaps they want the kind of closure that comes from truth rather than assumptions. Their friends finally understood. They had been trying to give your person an answer, but your person did not need someone else to decide what they felt. They needed the courage to face it, and that is what happened. The conversation eventually became less about you and more about your person's transformation, because sometimes another person becomes the mirror through which we see ourselves. Your person realized that their feelings for you had exposed parts of themselves they had avoided. They realized they were afraid of rejection, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of losing control, afraid of hearing an answer they did not want, afraid that if they admitted how much they cared, they would somehow become weaker. But last night, they learned something different. Honesty is not weakness. Vulnerability is not weakness. Caring deeply is not weakness. What matters is what you do with those feelings. Do you use them to pressure someone? Do you use them to manipulate someone? Or do you use them to become more honest, more responsible, more compassionate, and more willing to accept another person's freedom? Your person seemed to understand that distinction. They said that if they ever spoke to you again, they did not want to come with demands. They wanted to come with honesty. They wanted to say, "This is what I felt." Not, "You owe me." They wanted to say, "This is what I regret." Not, "You caused everything." They wanted to say, "I still care." Not, "You must come back." That difference is enormous, and perhaps that is why the conversation affected everyone so deeply, because the person they thought needed to move on was not actually asking to remain stuck. they were asking for permission to be honest with themselves. Their friends eventually stopped giving advice. Instead, they listened. Sometimes listening is the greatest gift we can give someone. Your person talked for a long time. They spoke about moments with you that they had never described before. They remembered details their friends had never heard. The way you reacted to certain things, the way you laughed, the way you made ordinary moments feel meaningful, the way a simple conversation could stay in their mind for days, the way they felt seen during moments when they did not feel understood by anyone else. They remembered your imperfections too. That mattered. Because this was not some fantasy about a flawless person. They knew you were human. They knew you had your own struggles. They knew you had made mistakes. They knew they had made mistakes, and somehow, remembering the imperfections made the feelings feel more real. They were not missing an imaginary version of you. They were remembering a real person who had left a real impression. At some point, one friend asked the question everyone had been avoiding: what if they don't feel the same anymore? Your person took a breath, then they said, "Then I will have to accept it." That answer surprised everyone, because earlier, they had been crying, but now their voice sounded calmer. They had finally reached the point where caring about you no longer meant demanding an outcome. They could acknowledge their feelings and still respect your freedom. They could hope without insisting. They could remember without becoming trapped. They could love a memory without allowing the memory to control their entire future. That is a powerful form of emotional growth, and perhaps the greatest surprise of last night was not that your person still cared. It was that they were beginning to understand what caring really means. It means wanting another person's happiness even when you cannot guarantee a place in it. It means apologizing without demanding forgiveness. It means communicating without manipulating. It means accepting boundaries. It means becoming better rather than simply becoming louder. It means learning from the past instead of trying to recreate it exactly. Your person may have started the night feeling defensive, but they ended it feeling strangely peaceful. They had finally said the thing they had been carrying. And sometimes saying the truth does not immediately solve a situation, but it changes the person carrying the truth. That matters, because the next chapter of someone's life often begins before anyone else can see it. It begins quietly. It begins when they stop lying to themselves. It begins when they admit what they want. It begins when they accept responsibility for what they did. It begins when they stop blaming circumstances for every painful outcome. It begins when they understand that if they want something different in the future, they must become willing to behave differently. And perhaps that is exactly where your person is now, standing at the edge of a realization. Not knowing what tomorrow brings, but finally knowing what yesterday meant. So if you have been wondering why everything feels emotionally unfinished, remember this: unfinished does not always mean meant to be. Sometimes unfinished means there is something you still need to understand. Sometimes it means an apology is needed. Sometimes it means forgiveness. Sometimes it means one final conversation. Sometimes it means accepting that you cannot rewrite the past. And sometimes it means discovering that the person you thought you had lost was actually the person who taught you how to stop losing yourself. That is why you should not build your life around signs, predictions, or assumptions about what another person will do. Let people show you through their choices. Let actions speak. Let honesty become visible. Let consistency become proof. Let respect become the foundation. If your person truly wants another chapter, they will eventually have to participate in creating it, not through dramatic declarations, through real communication, through accountability, through patience, through respect, and through the courage to hear your answer, whatever it may be. Last night may have been an emotional turning point for them, but your life is still yours, your future is still yours, your peace is still yours. You do not need to pause your growth while someone else figures out their heart. You do not need to wait by the door. You do not need to interpret every coincidence as a promise. You do not need to chase. You do not need to prove your worth. You do not need to convince anyone that you are valuable. If someone belongs in your life, healthy connection will require two people who freely choose each other. And if your paths cross again, let that meeting be based on truth rather than fantasy. Let it be based on who you both have become, because people change. Sometimes the person who walked away was not ready. Sometimes the person who stayed silent was afraid. Sometimes both people were growing in completely different directions, and sometimes time changes the perspective that distance could not. Your person seems to be discovering that now. They are beginning to understand.